All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling AI governance and potential legislation.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing that based on a pretty comprehensive report we've got here.
Hmm.
So really we're trying to understand, how do we harness the power of AI, but also put in place responsible practices,
Right.
which is going to be super crucial for the future of, innovation.
Absolutely. I mean, for those of our listeners who want to get up to speed quickly,
Mm-hmm.
on this topic, this deep dive is really going to be designed to try to cut through the noise
Yeah.
and to highlight the most important elements of AI governance, debates, and trends and stuff like that.
All right, so let's jump right into it.
Yeah.
One of the kind of key takeaways that I got right off the bat was this whole idea of how do we fuel the rapid progress in AI,
Right.
but also manage the potential downsides?
Hmm.
And it seems like there was, a lot of initial excitement around AI in things like healthcare and disaster response.
Hmm.
But now there's a growing awareness of the risks,
Right.
which I think is really interesting. Because it's
Yeah.
not that the benefits aren't still there. It's just that there are
Mhm.
certain areas like,
Yeah.
misinformation and privacy
Right.
that we need to be thinking more and more about.
Absolutely. And I think that that kind of shifting perspective is really what's driving the need for this idea of governance frameworks, right?
So when we talk about AI governance, I mean, what does that actually even, cover? What is that?
Yeah, I mean, think of it as kind of all the principles, laws, policies, standards, best practices, really kind of across the entire life cycle of AI,
Yeah.
from its development to deployment to use. And it's all aimed at kind of addressing these key things like accountability, transparency, fairness, you know,
Mm.
privacy, security, making sure AI is developed and used responsibly.
So what are the main debates that are kind of swirling around this idea of governance?
Yeah, I mean, a really central one is, to what extent should AI be regulated, right?
Right.
So, like, how do you balance fostering innovation,
Mhm.
allowing these amazing advances to continue,
Hmm.
but also mitigating potential harms?
Yeah.
So, where's that sweet spot? Some people think, governments should be really heavily involved. Others think it should be more industry self-regulation.
Right.
And then, of course, you have the whole challenge of getting global consensus
Yeah.
because different countries have different priorities, different kind of approaches.
In the report, they talk about a couple of international efforts that are, I guess, ongoing,
Yeah,
like the Paris AI Action Summit
yeah.
and the UK AI Safety Summit. What were those all about?
Yeah, so the Paris one, that really emphasized this idea of, using AI for the public good
Mm.
and also the importance of standardization, kind of trying to get everyone on the same page.
Right.
The UK summit, that was more focused on establishing some kind of global safety norms, right?
Right.
So, what are the kind of base level things that we all agree AI should not do?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you've got the UN and the G7. They're also involved in various ways.
Right.
But the report kind of points out that
Yeah.
whether all this is actually going to result in like a practical global regime,
Yeah.
that remains to be seen. It's still early days.
So speaking of kind of, legislation, I mean, what's actually happening around the world in terms of, AI law?
Yeah. So, I mean, the big one that everyone's talking about is the EU's AI Act.
Right.
This is a huge deal because it's like the world's first comprehensive legal framework for AI,
Hmm.
and they're using this risk-based approach,
Okay.
which basically means they categorize AI systems based on how risky they are, and then they have different rules for each category.
Interesting.
So, for example, some AI applications, they just ban outright
Okay.
things they consider unacceptable risk,
Mm.
like social scoring systems, where the government's tracking your every move and giving you a score. That's a big no-no. But then for high-risk systems, things like AI used in healthcare or education or law enforcement, they have like really strict requirements
Right.
for safety and transparency and accountability. So a lot of people think that the EU AI Act could end up becoming kind of a global standard
Yeah.
because it's so comprehensive and, it's the first one out there.
Now, what about the U.S.? What's happening over here?
Yeah, the U.S. is taking a different approach. It's much more sector-specific and fragmented.
Okay.
So there's no overarching federal law on AI.
Right.
Instead, you've got a mix of things like executive orders from the president, guidelines from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology,
Mhm.
and then you've got federal agencies like the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Right.
They're basically applying existing laws to AI.
No.
So, like, if an AI system is discriminating against people, the EEOC might step in.
And then you also have a lot of activity happening at the state level.
Yeah.
Like Colorado has a law specifically on algorithmic discrimination.
Yeah. Right.
So it's kind of all over the place.
It is, yeah. It's a patchwork, and it's also constantly evolving. Like,
Wow.
just recently, they rescinded an AI executive order.
Yeah.
So, things are changing rapidly.
Right.
But it's definitely something to watch, how this all develops.
So it sounds like the EU is taking this kind of top-down approach.
Right.
Where the U.S. is like, let's just see what happens and then, address things as we go.
Yeah, more of a bottom-up approach. And, each one has its pros and cons, right?
What about the rest of the world? Is anyone else doing anything interesting?
Yeah, definitely. China, they've introduced some interim measures for generative AI, so like ChatGPT and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
They're really focused on content regulation, making sure that the output is aligned with, their values and whatnot. Canada has proposed the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, ADA, which is still being debated. The UK, they're kind of going for a pro-innovation approach. They want to be seen as a leader in AI development, but also responsible development. And then Singapore has their Model AI governance framework, which is kind of interesting because it's more principles-based.
Right.
So it's not, hard and fast rules. It's more like guidelines.
So it's kind of like the Wild West out there. I mean, everyone's kind of doing their own thing.
It is a little bit. Yeah. I mean, the challenge is going to be, how do you harmonize all these different approaches globally? Because, the EU AI Act, that could create what they call a Brussels effect, where because it's so comprehensive, it ends up influencing regulations in other countries.
Right.
And the U.S., with its fragmented approach, that could lead to complexities for companies.
Yeah.
They have to comply with different rules in different places.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
One thing I've always kind of thought about is, when we put in regulations, are we stifling the very innovation we're trying to,
Yeah, that's a huge concern.
encourage?
The whole idea of overregulation, that it's going to stifle innovation, it's going to create barriers, especially for startups who might not have the resources to comply with all these complex rules. And then there's the issue that, AI is moving so fast that by the time you write a regulation, it could already be outdated.
Right.
So it's a tricky balance, but the report does make the point that regulation can actually be good for innovation in some ways, because it can foster public trust, right? If people trust AI, they're more likely to use it. Businesses are more likely to invest in it. It can also provide legal certainty, which again is good for investment. And it can help mitigate risks so that AI is used for beneficial applications. So, it's not as simple as regulation is bad, innovation is good. It's more nuanced than that.
So it sounds like it's all about finding that, Goldilocks zone where it's not too much, not too little.
Exactly. Yeah. Well-designed, risk-based regulations that are flexible enough to adapt to the rapid pace of change, but also strong enough to protect people from potential harms.
So who are all the players in this, game of AI governance?
Yeah, I mean, you've got all sorts of different stakeholders. You've got governments, obviously. They're the ones making the laws. And as we've seen, they have different approaches. The EU is more comprehensive. The US is more sector-specific. But they're all trying to balance this idea of, protecting the public interest with fostering innovation. Then you've got industry leaders, the big tech companies, and they generally acknowledge that governance is important. They want people to trust their products. But they also worry about stifling innovation, and they don't want to be burdened with too much compliance. Then you've got academic researchers. They're kind of exploring the ethical implications of AI, developing frameworks, analyzing the impact of regulations. And then you have civil society organizations. And they're advocating for responsible AI, raising concerns about potential harms and pushing for more inclusive approaches, making sure that the benefits of AI are shared widely. And, one interesting thing that the report points out is that there can actually be a divergence in views between AI experts who tend to be more optimistic about AI and the general public who might be more concerned about their risks and more supportive of regulation. So it's important to have all these different voices at the table.
So are there like existing guidelines or best practices out there that are helping to shape this whole landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got organizations like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development,
Hmm.
and UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Right.
They've both put forward like ethical AI principles,
Okay.
kind of high-level guidelines for how AI should be developed and used.
Hmm.
Then you've got frameworks like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework,
Yep.
which offers like a more structured approach to managing AI risks.
Hmm.
And then you have technical standards being developed by bodies like ISO, the International Organization for Standardization,
Right.
and IE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers.
Right.
So, there's a lot of work being done to kind of create this, this foundation for responsible AI.
So it sounds like, there's a lot of movement on kind of the high-level principles, the frameworks, the standards.
Right.
But are we also starting to see kind of more concrete guidelines that are tailored to specific sectors?
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, in healthcare, there's a lot of discussion about, patient safety and data privacy and the ethical implications of using AI in diagnosis and treatment.
Right.
In finance, there are concerns about, AI-powered fraud and algorithmic bias in lending.
Hmm.
And in autonomous vehicles, obviously, safety and reliability are paramount.
Right.
So we're seeing a shift from these kind of abstract principles
Hmm.
to more concrete guidelines and standards that are specific to the context in which AI is being used.
So, as we look ahead, what do you see as the major challenges and opportunities in this whole AI governance space?
Yeah, I mean, the report, it kind of highlights some key challenges. First of all, just defining AI.
Right.
It sounds simple, but it's actually really hard to come up with a definition that everyone agrees on,
Hmm.
and that can make it difficult to, write laws and regulations.
Yeah.
Then there's what they call the pacing problem, which is
Hmm.
basically this idea that AI innovation is moving so fast
Yeah.
that regulation struggles to keep pace. And then you have the issue of cross-border cooperation,
Right.
getting different countries to agree on a common set of rules.
Which we've seen is a challenge.
Yeah, it's really difficult, but, amidst all these challenges, there are also some really exciting opportunities.
Oh, yeah.
If we can get AI governance right, it could lead to a huge boost in public trust,
Hmm.
wider adoption of AI, more investment.
Mm.
It could help guide the development of AI in a way that's ethical and beneficial,
Yeah.
towards solving like really important problems like climate change or disease.
Right.
It could create a level playing field for businesses.
Right.
It could mitigate risks like bias and discrimination.
Right.
And it could even lead to enhanced international cooperation, countries working together to address these shared challenges.
That's a great point. I mean, AI is something that affects everyone.
Yeah.
So, getting that global cooperation piece right is going to be super important.
Absolutely. And one thing that the report really emphasizes is that
Yeah.
we can't rely solely on self-regulation.
Okay.
Companies, they need to be held accountable.
Right.
And that's where government oversight comes in.
Right.
So finding that right balance between, allowing innovation to flourish,
Hmm.
but also having some safeguards in place, that's going to be key.
So it sounds like this whole landscape of AI governance is incredibly, dynamic.
Yeah.
There's so many different players. There's ethical considerations. There's legislative efforts.
Right.
And ultimately, it's all about trying to balance innovation with responsibility.
Exactly.
The EU is kind of leading the charge with its AI Act.
Mhm.
The U.S. is taking a more fragmented approach.
Right.
And then you got all these other countries kind of, figuring out their own path.
Yep.
It's a fascinating time to be watching this space.
Absolutely. And it's going to be really interesting to see, how it all plays out in the years to come.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. But
Mm.
before we go, here's a final thought for all of our listeners out there.
Okay.
Given the rapid advancement of AI
Mhm.
and the ongoing debates about its governance,
Mhm.
what role do you as individuals see yourselves playing
Right.
in shaping the future of this technology
Mhm.
and ensuring its ethical and beneficial use?
Yeah.
What questions about AI governance are most pressing for you right now?
Right.
Let us know in the comments. And thanks for diving deep with us.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.
Bye.